Well, it seems to. Again, if you want to do the microphone. Good evening, and welcome to the Co-Cathedral of St. John the Evangelist. I'm delighted to see you all here in person tonight, and welcome the attendees joining us on the live stream for our third session of reflections on Lent and the event of Easter through art. In our reflection series, we predominantly focus on European works of art from the 16th to the 20th centuries. Tonight, however, as we are following the Gospel readings of Christ's Passion, we are stepping a little bit further back in time. Our first work of art of this evening, The Entry into Jerusalem by Giotto. Is from the beginning of the 14th century. The so-called Proto-Renaissance. Proto-Renaissance art is a term used to describe the art of the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance period, which was characterized by the emergence of new artistic styles that would later influence the Renaissance proper. The Proto-Renaissance period began in the late 13th century and lasted until the beginning of the early 15th century. The second work of art, The Washing of the Feet by Tintoretto, was painted in 1548-49, the time of the High Renaissance during the 16th century. Our third and last work of art of this evening, The Agony in the Garden by Giuseppe Vasari, was created in 1597-98, during the era of the late Renaissance and the beginning of the Baroque. For the next few minutes, I will briefly introduce the concept of perception. Perspective, there we go, perspective. Thank you. The oldest figurative art is believed to have been created on cave walls in Spain about 35 to 65,000 years ago. This is a photograph of prehistoric art found in the Altamira cave in Spain. The ochre and charcoal image of the bison, alongside handprints and horses found in the same cave, are amongst the best preserved prehistoric paintings worldwide. We have, however, come a long way from there in terms of realistic depiction of the visual world. One important aspect to create a three-dimensional illusion of a physical space or a human form on a two-dimensional surface is the understanding of perspective. Many scholars believe that linear perspective was invented by the Greeks and continued to be used by the Romans, as we can see here in a fresco of a Roman villa. As illustrated here, orthogonal lines will convert into a vanishing point on the horizon line, creating the illusion of depth on a flat surface. The Middle Ages, or medieval times, begin with the disintegration of the Western Roman Empire in the second half of the 5th century and lasted about 900 years until 1600 AD. The cultural fabric of Northern Europe was then determined by the various tribes, the Franks, Vandals, Goths, Angles, and Saxons, and many more, who took the place of the Romans and who established new patterns of settlement and centers of authority. The colored lines in this map represent the movements of the various tribes throughout Europe. During the Middle Ages, a huge change in artistic development occurred as well. New art genres were created through fusion of different artistic traditions, such as Middle Eastern and African art. During medieval times, all across Europe, stunning artworks in wood and metalwork, and later illuminated and illustrated manuscripts and books would inspire the early Renaissance. The medieval period encompassed 8 major artistic movements: the Byzantine, Islamic, Viking, Carolingian, Celtic, Ottonian, Romanesque, and Gothic. Similarly, the Middle Ages were a time when art reflected the flourishing of Christianity across Europe. The spread of Christianity is shown on the slide in the increasing area of the purple color. So it started around Italy, and then by 1500, most parts of Europe, and also the parts of today's Turkey, were all Christian. A key point to remember about the art of the early Middle Ages was the concern of the Bible's prohibition of graven images. Medieval art was mostly created without linear perspective, therefore appeared somewhat abstract. Examples of this type of work are icons. For Byzantine Christians and Orthodox Christians today, the icon was a true copy of a holy image. Because icons depict a holy and infinite presence, not the temporal physical world, icons avoid direct reference to earthly reality, to time or place. They are characterized by the complete lack of realism. Instead, backgrounds are dematerialized with shimmering gold, and settings are schematized. Paintings appear flat, without shadows, and figures often look static and timeless. Besides icons, illuminated manuscript played an important role in the development of art during the Middle Ages. These handwritten books have been decorated with gold and silver, brilliant colors, as well as elaborated designs and miniature pictures. In early medieval times, monks were the sole makers of illuminated manuscripts. Before universities existed, monasteries were the central place for learning. Monks copied books mainly, but not solely, for use in worship. Most of the books they copied were religious, so Bibles, gospel books, books used for church services, and prayer books meant for private worship. These texts were mostly in Latin, the official language in the church. The Book of Kells is one of the most famous artifacts in the world. The illuminated manuscript was made by Scottish or Irish monks around 800. The book illustrates the 4 Gospels of the Christian New Testament with arresting, beautiful attention to detail. While many stunning illuminated manuscripts were made during this time, the Book of Kells is particularly remarkable for the majestic wonder of its highly detailed illustrations. Other extraordinary examples of illuminated manuscripts are the Lindisfarne Gospel, the Book of Durr, and the Book of Hours. The medieval art era eventually came to an end with the emergence of the Proto-Renaissance, which saw a recovery of the skills and values associated with classical art that had been lost for centuries. Artists revived the use of linear perspective and the idea of realism. In the West, the Proto-Renaissance came to foster styles that could tell stories. Church frescoes, mosaics, and panel paintings illustrated the lives of Christ, the Virgin, and saints. Artists sought to capture the world of everyday experience with greater reality, relying less on the idealized religious images of the medieval times. Among the first and most important artists to move into this direction was Giotto. Giotto, in full Giotto di Bondone, was born in 1266, 67, or 1276, and he died in 1337 in Florence. Giotto was the most important Italian painter of the 14th century, whose works point to the future innovations of the Renaissance style that developed over the next century. 700 years later, Giotto continues to be admired as the father of European painting and the first of the great Italian masters. Giotto was the first Western artist since antiquity to capture the weight and the mass of bodies moving in space. He made them three-dimensional with light and shadow, placing figures in realistic environments. He abandoned the decorative pattern and complicated lines of Byzantine art. His shapes are simple and his forms are heavy. Giotto further animates his figures with facial expressions and emotions. And this is one of his famous paintings. And it's the emotion are we can really tell. And this is really the first time again we can find this in paintings. One of Giotto's most important masterpieces is the sequential series of fresco paintings illustrating the life of the Virgin Mary and the life of Christ on the interior walls of the Scrovegni Chapel, also known as the Arena Chapel, painted in the years between 1304-06, as shown on this slide. So this is the chapel, and you walk in, and every square millimeter of that chapel is covered with fresco and with paint. The Arena Chapel is a small church adjacent to a monastery in Padua, the region of Veneto, Italy. In 2021, the chapel was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The frescoes are considered to have profoundly influenced the stylistic development of the Western art. This leads us now to our first work of art of the evening, The Entry to Jerusalem, painted by Giotto as part of the series of the frescoes in the Arena Chapel, which I have just introduced. As you consider tonight's first painting, I would like to quote from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, verse 8 to 10. I quote, "A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and that followed were shouting, 'Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest.'" End of quote. And now I would like to ask you what you see in this painting and what your first impressions are. And leading questions are always literally, what do we see? Does it reflect the story that I just was referring to? Can we read the story in the painting?
Yeah, as you were reading that, I've seen everything you're saying, I've seen it in the picture.
Yeah.
As you were reading Matthew, I could see what you were describing the words illustrated in the picture. Someone picking the palms, the lying clothes or clothing or capes on the road and the crowd.
Yeah. Yeah, so we can see someone is placing the cloak on the road, and I thought it was really neat. Here we see them taking them off. They're actively in the process of taking them off. And this figure also is kind of trying to pull out his sleeve out of the arm. So Giotto was very good in representing that, the movement, active movement. And it's really important. The reason why I went through the introduction is for us to keep in mind when this was painted. This was painted right after we saw the icons, which were really still, they were like frozen. So we need to, because we are used to seeing Renaissance paintings with wonderful perspective. But this was at a different time. It hadn't been rediscovered. So I think this is really neat to see that.
Where is that?
Okay.
Where is that in the room that you showed us? The first picture you showed us, you could see that it was on the wall on the left. Is this near that same
Arena.
fresco?
Mm-hmm. So it's also in the arena. I'm not quite sure exactly where. I didn't look that up, but it's we can go back. The upper tier is the story and the life of Mary, and then the lower tiers are the life of Christ. I'm not quite sure.
The second lower tier.
So the Lamentation is here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right there, right by you. Second tier down, the first painting by you. Right, up, over.
Oh, there. Yeah. There it is. Yeah.
It seems so light. Like where the action is with Jesus, the colors are light. And then it's kind of ominous or darker in the background, almost like you know it's coming. At least that's what it makes me think of, like those dark blues at the top.
Mm-hmm.
It seems gloomy at the top there.
He's the source of the light, because if you look where the shadow of light is, he's emanating it. Because their backs are in shadow.
Right. The Hallows. Yeah. And I didn't read that part from the reading, but it is important to kind of point out the donkey. So in the earlier in the gospel, Jesus sends out his disciples to fetch a donkey, and the foal. And I thought also it was magnificent to see how Giotto was able to implement a little bit of movement. So pulling up the front leg of the donkey, and we kind of can feel that it is moving through the picture, moving into the space. And also kind of the ears, they're not just static, they're kind of in different directions. And then we see it's a colt actually, a young donkey. And just anyone, yeah.
I noticed already the blue on his garment, which looks to me like an accident, but I know it probably wasn't. But it just reminds me of Christ, in the Christological sense that he's human and he's divine, because it's the same color that's in the sky, so that is making me, think about him in that way,
Mm-hmm.
that he's of heaven, right? He's God's son, but he's also fully man.
Yeah. And I love that. I think that kind of thread we have seen coming through many of our works. And artists are constantly have to deal with that. How do we present that? And I think often it is through color, the color combination, very much so, yes.
The other thing that I noticed is, that all the people behind Jesus are probably part of, presumably, our children, but their faces are very adult looking.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, what I notice about that transition from what was an icon or an icon to more of an action painting.
Oh, interesting. Yes. So they're more static-like or the icon-like,
Mm-hmm.
and then these are more animated. Yes. So then also reflecting the holiness of the disciples versus the people that welcome him in Jerusalem. Yes. And I also like when Brian mentioned the colors, it's also quite often we see Christ with the combination of red and blue, to the red for the color of his passion and death, the blue for the heaven. Here, and sometimes with the frescoes, and we have to remember it's 700 years old, so some of the colors might have faded a little bit, but I think in this fresco, Giotto chose a softer red or kind of a pink. And if we think of the meaning of pink within church, it's a joyous color. It's Advent. It's the pink color that represents joy. And I think at this point it was still a very joyful moment for Christ, because he always wanted to move into Jerusalem. He wanted to go to the most holy city, and it's a joyous moment. The people are receiving him with great joy at this moment in time, right? They're calling out for him. They're coming out. They want to see him. They praise him.
Is there some paint in this picture that may have fallen off? I'm just trying to understand, that kind of greenish in the middle of the picture. Was that once blue, and is that some loss of pigment?
Probably I would think loss of pigment. Because I think the painting per se is complete, and maybe there is more of the blue that just kind of got lost.
My eye went toward this picture. The first thing I saw was the donkey. knew how symbolic this was, because Christ entered Jerusalem on a donkey. The Romans would enter on a horse. But I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure he was well versed, but I love that you bring this up because I spent a little bit of time reading up on horses, and exactly that is this great distinction between Christ as our King, but he chose to be humble. Right? He chose to come in and enter the most holy city on a donkey rather than a horse. And donkeys are the symbol for peace, rather than horses usually are being ridden by warrior kings, and they use them to, if they want to go out and start a war. So I believe so. And obviously in the gospel reading, it was a plan of God had it all thought out, and it was a plan, and he wanted his son to enter on a peaceful manner into the most holy city.
I have just a little funny note, and it's the little baby donkey that's right to the bottom there. So obviously that's a female donkey that she's mother.
Yes, yep. In the scripture was also very specific that the disciples should go and they would find a donkey with a colt. And there's, I think, a little bit of symbolism in that as well. So donkeys are, we would say, they're rather stubborn, and they don't really do what we ask them to do. However, once they gain the trust of the humans, and they feel comfortable with the human, they are actually amazing animals. When you think of, trekkers going up dangerous mountains or small passageways, they don't take horses, they take donkeys, because donkeys have an incredible vision, they have an incredible hearing, and they are not flight animals. So if there's a danger, they usually kind of just freeze in place. And so it's much safer. So if you go up a mountain and there's suddenly stones are coming down, or there's a dangerous drop, a horse would flee with all your stuff and would put you much in danger. A donkey will kind of freeze, assess the situation, and make the best out of it. So donkeys are actually incredible animals, and I think all that was important, and that's very significant for our king to have chosen a donkey rather than a horse.
This is something we've discussed before. I see a lot of diagonal lines pointing to Christ, and even in his clothes. The folds of the scarf that the lady is taking off, the hem of it is aiming up, and as Christ being the center
Yes.
of
Yeah.
the work. Even Christ's, and whatever it is that he's wearing is coming up.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, so everything is in all the green, all leading up to Christ.
The diagonal lines, and we discussed this with other works.
Exactly, yes. And artists tend to do that, right? Kind of helping us visually to very quickly decipher an image and see who is the most important figure in a painting. Yes, very wonderful. Yeah. So I think, it's probably time to move on. So I don't want to cut the other paintings short. We had that last week a little bit, and as we quick summary, as we were talking about this, and kind of it's a joyous moment, and people actually coming out of the city to welcome him. But as we know, since we're just entering the Passion, things will turn around very quickly. And so I will leave this picture in asking, is our faith as transient as the crowds that welcome Jesus to Jerusalem? So we are welcoming one day, but in a few days later we call for his crucifixion. So now it is time to move on to our second painting of this evening. It is entitled The Washing of the Feet and was painted by Jacopo Robusti Tintoretto in 1548 to 1549. Tintoretto was born in 1518 or 19 and died in 1594 in Venice. He was, along with Titian and Veronese, one of the most important Venetian artists of the 16th century. Jacopo had taken his professional name of Tintoretto, the little dyer, from his father's occupation as a dyer, tintore in Italian. He is believed to have started an apprenticeship with Titian, but was dismissed after a short period of time. No further records are available about his training, and he might have been self-taught through copying works of art of other artists, especially sculptures, drawings from life, and even dissecting corpse. Most of Tintoretto's paintings are large-scale narratives on canvas, animated by dramatic lighting and gestures. Tintoretto's art is characterized by daring inventiveness in both handling and composition. His paintings are notable for their free, painterly technique, their dynamism, and their unconventional approach to the depiction of narrative scenes, particularly biblical events. His art provided inspiration to later artists, such as El Greco and Peter Paul Rubens. Tintoretto ran a large workshop in Venice. No one else came close to matching the sheer number of pictures he provided for Venice churches, confraternities, government buildings, and private palaces. Our painting of this evening, The Washing of the Feet, is now located at the Museo del Prado in Madrid. However, it was commissioned to hang on the right-hand side, and this becomes quite important as we start to look at the picture a little bit more closely. As you consider our second work of art of the evening, I will quote from the Gospel of John, chapter 13, verses 5, 6, 8, and 14. I quote, "Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, 'Lord, are you going to wash my feet?' Jesus answered, 'Unless I wash you, you will not have a share with me. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." End of quote. And now I would like to ask you what you see in this picture, how you perceive it. And there's lots of interest.
Apostle, I counted 11, unless it's implying Judas is not there.
Exactly. So it is. And that's a very good starting point. It seems a little bit distorted in some way, right? It's kind of spread out. The painting has many empty spaces. And since you mentioned Judas, I will point him out. He's actually way back here in the distance. So he placed himself in the dark, he removed himself, because this is after he already had received the 30 gold coins, and he betrayed Jesus already. So he puts himself in the back. And that's really, exactly, and interesting, and that was discussed in some writings about Tintoretto. Usually, most artists did not give Judas a halo at this point in the paintings. However, Tintoretto still gave him a halo. So we can discuss that in detail why, but that was very interesting. So if you compare other paintings of the washing of the feet, Judas usually has no halo anymore, if there are halos in the painting per se.
Just going to go on with the disciples. You can see Jesus giving Peter and John there as Jesus is washing Peter's feet.
Mm-hmm.
And it just made me think as well, too, that Peter and John were with Jesus during the 80th party and crucifixion for a little bit. Of course, John was there at the time of his death. And yeah, it's a very interesting print. And it's also interesting in the back, like you said, it was in Venice. And we just came back from Venice, so just kind of notice that in the background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is, where are we? We're probably in Venice rather than in Jerusalem. So we have seen that often before. An artist will pull or draw the images in a more timely fashion rather than setting it into their historical setting. And that's done to also represent, it's timeless, that the Passion of Christ for us happens every year, so it's a timeless event. So it doesn't need to be set into a background or an environment of that would represent Jerusalem 2,000 years ago.
Oh yeah, I just had one thought. Going on with the Judas thing, I was thinking that the guy on the ground was Judas because he seemed very hesitant to take off his whatever he's trying to take off. I don't know what's going on. And it's hard to make out the halo on that guy that's on the ground too.
Mm-hmm.
The one right in the kind of middle of
Yeah.
the two guys that are wrestling right on the ground. Those guys, yeah. The other thing is, I don't know what that image is in the very back there, right? But it looks like the Last Supper from here, like what happened before, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, exactly.
But like you had brought out, it's the passion that's happening now. So yeah, I agree with that symbolism. I love it. But we'll be celebrating the washing of feet as well too, 2,000 years from now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So, and so there's a lot of multiple layers in this picture, but let's start with this exactly. So Tintoretto decided to add the Last Supper into this painting of washing the feet, just as a reference to the past. So we will see the painting is represents the past. So the Last Supper that just had happened. It represents the present with washing the feet. And it also, there's a reference to the future. There's a river in the back, and there's a arch of triumph, and there's a obelisk. So those are signs of victory. So from here, from the present, Christ has to go through death, but he will go onto the boat. He will be carried into heaven. Triumphantly, with the reference of the arch and the obelisk. Yes, and so the really bizarre thing is why. So I would like to point out this painting in reality is 209 inches wide. So that's 5.5 meters. That's big. So that's wider than the Transfiguration was tall. So one would wonder why, if the artist had 5 meters space, why would he choose to paint the main object, the main subject of the painting, squish it to the right, to the side here, and kind of obscure, scattering the disciples throughout the room. And for a while, because the painting is in the Prado for a long time, and that's how people look at it straight on. And I was mentioning earlier, it's during the Renaissance, and there's a little bit of mannerism developing. So many scholars interpreted this painting as kind of a Mannerisque. Mannerisque tends to be a bit obscure, using different perspectives. However, in a small area, and the congregation would be sitting on the right-hand side. It was sitting on the far end and would look at this painting diagonally. And everyone on this side is going to really see the effect. And if you guys want to move over. As I tilt this, can you see the difference? And particularly, I help you a little bit. So this is the orthogonal line going into the vanishing point. No sense. The empty spaces disappear. This figure that on the far left, that seemed rather big and out of proportion, now fits into the painting much better. So that's why Father Mann mentioned that last week when we looked at the Transfiguration, that Jesus seemed too big or out of proportion. That is always we have to remember to look at works of art in the space that they were created for, which makes a huge difference, how they're being perceived. And then suddenly it makes sense, because the artist spent so much time on thinking about this. And this kind of is connecting us back to my introduction with the linear perspective. Tintoretto was a master in perfection.
Did he use models?
Yes. Who else? Yes. Yes. So they believe that he made little puppeteers and set them out to really make sure that it worked in the space and also so he was able, and he used candles to make sure he would paint the shadows correctly. And then also he designed it almost like a theatrical stage. So he started with the table and then brought it into, and then they hung it. And then he started adding the figures to really make it come together perfectly at that point.
So is there any significance to the dog? I mean, he's rather...
Oh yeah, no, I was waiting for it. Yeah, what about the dog? Renaissance artists started to add animals sometimes. And since the work of art was commissioned and someone, usually the church, would pay for it, they had to have the work of art approved before they would receive the payment. And there are reports that if the church thought it was rather a distraction or wouldn't fit into, artists were often asked to take them out again and draw over it. There is a reference to this in his bibliography, that he got into trouble adding the dog, but he must have made a point why he thought the dog was should stay, and he seemed that he was successful with his argument. And it is, I mean, dogs symbolize loyalty, they are faithful. So again, if we see it in that way, in this interpretation, then it makes sense. Or not sense, but it is, he probably could argue his case. There's a really neat story about this, and I just would like to show this. So a very good friend of Tintoretto's was Giacomo Bassano. He was a contemporary artist together with Tintoretto in Venice, and he is very well known for Bassano's. It's in the Louvre in Paris. And I was just looking around, and so he probably invited his friend, and he had the idea, he wanted to add the dog to the painting, and so it was a collaborative work. So Bassano painted the dog in Tintoretto's painting. It is. Yeah.
Do you notice the dog is one of the few characters actually looking directly at the image?
Yes. The Prado, where the camera then walks over here to help us to understand how we're supposed to see the painting. So yeah, again, there's a lot more things to explore in this painting. Again, this is a very full painting. We haven't even touched on what emotions the disciples probably were going through. We saw some of them were kind of ready to take off their sandals. Others needed some help. So there was probably a lot of emotions and thought going through this disciples' mind, and what is happening. And it was all very scary for them as well. So I think there's as we go through the three works of art, I think the main topic besides perspective is change in emotion. We're going from a very joyful moment to this, which becomes somewhat confusing, certainly for the disciples. And then also as an example in how we should follow. So I will leave you with the question: are we able to follow Christ's examples to serve others in our community? Now it is time to explore our third and last painting of the evening, The Agony in the Garden, by Giuseppe Casari, painted in 1597-98. Casari was one of the most important artists in Italy in the late 16th century and early 17th centuries. Casari was likely born in the town of Apino, located between Rome and Naples, in 1568, and was taught by his father, a painter of sacred images. Casari moved to Rome around 1581, where he went on to develop a classical style, characterized by narrative clarity, symmetry, and large imposing figures. From 1592, Casari served as the principal painter to Pope Clement VIII in Rome. In the late 1950s, he was knighted by the Pope for his decorations in the church of San Giovanni in Laterano, and went on to design the mosaics for the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, as well as completing many other projects in oil and fresco in and around Rome. I would like you to once again focus your attention on the painting as I read a brief quote from the Gospel by Matthew, chapter 26, verses 36, 39, and 45. I quote, "Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and going a little bit further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, 'My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. yet not what I want, but what you want." Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners." End of quote. One more time, I invite any comments and what you see, maybe what time of day we are at, who are the figures.
When you look at the angel, my eye is drawn to the light at the top left of the angel, but the way her arms are outstretched, it's almost in the shape of the cross, and descending.
Yes.
That caught me right away.
Yeah, and the angel is also holding a cross.
He's actually holding, okay.
Yeah. So it has the hands out, and then there's a wooden cross behind it.
Light source hitting.
So the painting can be somewhat divided in kind of a right and left, but also in a top and bottom area. So if we start with the top and bottom, on the upper half, we see Jesus in the light, and we could almost, I kind of cropped this out, and it could be almost a alone standing painting with his agony as he calls out to his Father, but not to ask to be set free from it, but he's accepting whatever the Father asks him to do. But yeah, so the angel is kind of the main light source. It's beautiful, illuminating Jesus, his face and his clothing. And here he's wearing a white tunic and a beautiful blue cloth. Again, kind of the white for his righteousness, the blue for heavenly powers. And then on the bottom half, we have the disciples. And again, it's Peter, John, and James. It's the same three disciples that went together with Jesus up on the mountain during the Transfiguration. And they have fallen asleep. One thing is, if we would, coming back to diagonals, if we would draw a diagonal from the angel and kind of the cross all the way through, it would so it would go through Christ and it would fall right onto Peter. All the way. So Peter's still kind of highlighted. Again, he will deny Christ 3 times, but at the end of the day, he's the rock of the church. So he's still in the light. And then if we divide the painting to right and left side, on the right we have the moon, the crescent of the moon, which is a little bit of a light source, but can't compete with the light of an angel that's shining out. And it's again probably a foreshadowing of the dark hour. There's clouds really close coming up to it, so it's when Jesus dies and the sun is covered, so darkness setting in. And there's a scene down here, and you actually, I think, can almost see it better on the handout than you can see it on the screen or even on my. And I kind of try to zoom into it. It is Judas coming in with the Roman soldiers, and they have little lanterns. And supposedly Jews. There's kind of Zari presents us with the presence, but also foreshadows the future in his paintings. Yeah. Where is it?
Usually when I think about the apostles falling asleep, I don't know what I usually think of it. This painting really makes it seem like there's so much going on in the top left corner. Like, how could they possibly have fallen asleep? Or not woken up? because it's so bright. It's almost like the sun, right, shining on them. It makes it seem a little ridiculous that they fell asleep, which I know we probably think that it was, so that's the way the story is told, because Jesus gets mad at them and says, how can you be asleep? And this really gives me that impression of like, I mean, they didn't wake up, and there was an angel, and there was light, and there was heaven opened up to tend to Christ, and they're still just snoozing.
I think they were probably not necessarily sleeping, but I think they were presenting us, right? Don't we fall asleep? If we think of even the Lenten time, it's really long, 40 days. And to kind of maintain the enthusiasm for it, so it's probably us who's represented. We are falling asleep, we are being distracted, and it's also a lot to understand. And maybe the disciples it's a hard time for us to really grasp what was happening. On the other hand, it is also a lot to grasp. So again, I think there's a lot of emotions that we have seen throughout the three paintings, from joy to confusion, to being just very tired and having a hard time to digest it all.
Well, that's, sorry.
To me, the light, to me, it looks like the light on the sleeping apostles is coming from the angel in heaven, because in the upper right corner, that light seems to be coming from the opposite direction, looking at the cloud and the light on the right side of the orb.
Yes, absolutely. I think so too. So the angel, because the angel is coming straight from heaven, so the light has to be brighter. It's illuminating the entire scene.
I think they get sleepy and tired because they don't quite understand the mysteries that are unfolding before them. They're just humans like us. They get tired.
Too right to say, oh yeah, Jesus told us something is going to happen, but it's not this weekend. It's going to happen another time. Yes. Oh, absolutely.
I'm struck by the blue and the white and then the blue color of Jesus that runs the diagonal to Peter, who also has the blue.
Mm-hmm.
And then John is the one next to him that has the red, which will care for Jesus' mother.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of interesting that James is sort of, same with the stone. He's not as pronounced.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, so the colors are echoing each other a little bit, and they're associating with each other. Yes?
If you knew nothing about what the figures, or who the figures should be, John looks feminine to me. And I kind of like that. I mean, with his ties to Mary. I look at John and I see a woman there.
Mm-hmm.
I find that really
Just not as hands or feet.
And I think the lady had it.
I was just going to say that it just says Peter, James, and John visually are very similar to Jesus. I like how Cesare sort of made the betrayers in the distance very similar visually to the brambles in the foreground. I mean, just to emphasize that they're powerless. They're like they don't bear fruit. They're dried up. They'll be thrown in the fire in that way. So I like the contrast between you know, who represents what in these paintings.
The other thing I find interesting, this is in Ohio. Is this the first thing you have shown us in these series that's actually been in the U.S.? Most of the paintings you've highlighted have been in Europe.
Yes, indeed. Yes. For this series, yes, no, that it is true. Yes, for this series, this is the first painting that is in the American Museum. That's right. Yeah.
I think you had one for Advent that's in Indianapolis, right? Do you remember?
Was it this?
New Fields.
Oh, yeah.
Then you came to the
first one.
In Indianapolis, check out New Fields. It's a
Yeah.
neat museum.
Yeah, and thank you very much. I think we need to draw to a close. And I think, so the main threads through the works of art tonight were using perspective and how it has developed over centuries. And we saw wonderful examples how the artists really embraced this and how emotions can be displayed in the work of art. And I would like to leave you with the last question. Coming back to the quote from the reading, and do I do what I want to do in my life, or do I do what Christ wants me to do? Thank you very much for coming, and hope to see you next week again. Thank you.